It's my pleasure to introduce John Clayton today. I met John first when I was living in Red Lodge, and he and I circulated kind of in the same group of expats, people who immigrated to Montana from other places. And many of you here also did the same thing. But most of us have adopted Montana as a place where our soul feels most at home. I never had thought of what it's like to have an outsider's view of the West. I always assumed I was part of it as soon as I came, partly because my father's family has Western credentials from Nebraska and Wyoming, and he even had an uncle, my great-uncle, who ran with the Wild Bunch. His name was Elzie Lay. He ended up leaving them and becoming a fairly well-to-do oil man, interestingly enough. Basically, I realized that an outsider's view is always a unique one. I heard Jerzy Kosinski, who wrote a book called The Painted Bird, is that correct? He's a Polish author, and he was interviewed, and he said there's something about learning a new language or going to a new place. You see things in a magical way that people who grew up here do not. And I think that's true for me. I've always thought of Montana as one of the most exotic places in the world, even though I've lived in some exotic places. I realized that being an expat can be a blessing because you see the unique cultural quirks and patterns that are present in a culture. John is one of those examples. He has researched, although he came from Massachusetts, he has researched and written extensively about Western topics and Western lore. He's uniquely qualified to give us this objective view, if you want to call it that, or maybe exotic view, with a great deal of affection. He attended college in Massachusetts at Williams College. The other thing we have in common is that we both are PKs and both moved here later in life. It's a pleasure to have you here today, John. Okay.
Thanks, Margaret. Thanks, everyone, for inviting me here. I grew up as a PK, a preacher's kid, and so every week, my father was standing up in front of a crowd on a Sunday morning like this, and so I want to thank you for helping me now to embody that cliche that we all eventually turn into our parents. I'm going to talk to you about three sort of lessons I've learned from my studies in Montana history, and I think I'd just like to sort of share with you some perspectives and leave you to contemplate, discuss among yourselves later the implications of those perspectives, including the spiritual implications, so that you can incorporate these thoughts into whatever values and beliefs you have or choose not to. But I'm just going to offer sort of some things that I've learned, and let me start by telling a story about. It was 6 or 8 years ago, I was having a conversation with Alvin Ellis, who's a fourth-generation Montana rancher outside of Luther. Alvin's been a Republican legislator and someone who is very immersed in a certain culture that's very different than mine. And we were talking about the Zane Grey novel, Riders of the Purple Sage, and we were disagreeing about it. I said that I felt Riders of the Purple Sage, the landscape was just ridiculous. If you know that novel, towards the end of it, the hero is riding along a horse in sort of a mountainous, almost glacier national park type place, and then they go through a tiny notch and they end up in the Surprise Valley, which sort of looks like Zion. I mean, it's warm and red rock, and how can that be so close to something that's so like glacier? I said, this is not realistic, and Alvin totally disagreed with me. He thought that Zane Grey's depictions of landscapes were very realistic, that as he lives on his ranch and interacts with landscape every day, he feels that Zane Grey's words could really capture the sunlight or the trees or the grasses, that Zane Grey was better than most authors at depicting landscape. And so that was a friendly discussion. It was only later that I realized that here we had this fairly lengthy discussion about a novel in which we weren't talking about the characters, we weren't talking about the plot, we weren't talking about the themes, this notion that the Surprise Valley perhaps represents some sort of Eden. We were talking about authenticity. Did Zane Grey really capture the landscape as we understand it? And I thought, why? What is it about the West that makes us so interested in authenticity? And it does seem to me that this happens more in the West than it does in other regions. Can you imagine having a discussion about Henry James or William Faulkner or Toni Morrison saying, well, yes, they really captured what New York looked like or felt like or smelled like? So maybe that is a unique Western fascination with authenticity. As I thought about that, I reflected on Caroline Lockhart, the woman whose reading we just had. I wrote a book about Caroline and her fascinating life. And I came across reviews of several of her novels. This particular review is not for the one we read from, but another one called The Man from the Bitterroots. And the reviewer said, Miss Lockhart manages to get the real stuff into her stories of the West. The look, the very smell of the land, the talk of the men, the sense of adventure, and the stress of life that belongs in wild places. So again, the reviewer is looking at the authenticity of the work rather than its plot or its characters or its themes. He wants a novel to show what life is really like in the West, which I think is different. A different expectation than we have of novels from elsewhere. Another reviewer said, we have always maintained that Caroline Lockhart has an unfair advantage in the business of writing Western stories. Her advantage is not in that she has lived in the West and knows it, but in that she has absorbed it. And so, again, they're judging her as a Westerner. And there has been some criticism that perhaps Zane Grey didn't portray the West effectively enough because he didn't really live here. He lived in New Jersey. Caroline Lockhart lived in Cody, a lot of reviewers said, and that meant that she was authentic. That meant that she was real. And so what is it about that? Why do we value that? As Margaret mentioned, I grew up in Massachusetts, in suburban Boston, fairly close to the towns where Paul Revere made his famous ride during the American Revolution. And so as a child, I learned the Longfellow poem about Paul Revere and his ride. Later, I learned that actually Longfellow took a fair amount of poetic license in that he didn't mention William Dawes, and he didn't, he dramatized it in certain ways and maybe didn't portray it accurately. And the attitude that I and I think most people that I knew back there, it was sort of a shrug. Oh, well, yeah, it was a nice poem, though. We remember it. It's a nice way to teach those themes to kids. But compare that to, say, the Battle of Little Bighorn, which was similarly mythologized for the first 50 years or so after that. And then as some other people started to say that maybe Custer wasn't brilliant or wise or brave, that generated a whole lot of controversy in ways that I don't think we had controversy about Paul Revere. That somehow the notion of getting into the authenticity of it matters more out here. What the facts really were matter. To cover another, I've mentioned Zane Grey and Caroline Lockhart, another contemporary of theirs in sort of inventing the Western novel was the inventor of Hopalong Cassidy. Most of us know Hopalong Cassidy from the 50s but those novels were actually written in the 1900s, and the fellow who wrote them had actually never been to the West. He had never been outside of Illinois, but he had an encyclopedic knowledge of the West. I mean, literally, he looked in encyclopedias and, okay, that river is located there, and this gun does this, and I'm going to put that into my books because people want that authenticity. One final example of authenticity comes from Cody, Wyoming. Many of you have probably been to the museum there, and the art museum has a window that looks out on a big statue of Buffalo Bill on a horse. You can also see it if you just sort of drive straight down Main Street and don't turn in front of the museum. That was dedicated in 1924. Caroline Lockhart had a big role in that. And it was incredibly controversial when a sort of rough draft of it was proposed. Everyone in Cody was furious. Why were they furious? Was it because the statue was being made by Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney, a rich Easterner who didn't know the West, a woman? Were they upset because Whitney was using this as a way to sort of burnish the legacy of Buffalo Bill for her own political aims, to try to make people appreciate a certain set of values that she felt that Buffalo Bill represented? Was it because they weren't really sure that they wanted this representation of Buffalo Bill in their town? Actually, Cody and Buffalo Bill had been at odds through most of the aughts and teens. No, it wasn't any of that. They were angry because of the way she drew the horse. That's not a real He-Man horse. That's a polo pony kind of horse. If you're going to have a statue of a horse in Cody, Wyoming, it needs to be a horse that's going to be here. So they were fascinated with the authenticity of the details. Now, maybe they were using that as a way to criticize all of the politics or all of the cultural issues surrounding that. But they didn't express it that way. They expressed it solely in terms of issues of authenticity. I'm not saying this is good or bad. I'm just saying it's maybe interesting, maybe different in the West than other places. Perhaps we really need authenticity because if you end up 50 miles out in the middle of nowhere when a big storm comes on and you're on a polo pony, you could be in trouble. But I do think that it's an interesting difference, an interesting value of Westerners. So, authenticity as a unique Western value. Let me talk about another one, and that's government. During the Willie Fire in 2000 that threatened Red Lodge when I was there, the Forest Service had a big meeting in the Civic Center where they could inform us as to what was going on in the fire. And Kent Young stood up. Some of you may know Kent, an attorney and environmentalist in Red Lodge, and he said, "What can I do? I want to help fight this fire. It's threatening my town, and my knees aren't so good anymore, but I'm sure I could get out there and swing an axe or something. Surely there's something I can do to help." And the Forest Service people said, "Kent, there's nothing you can do. You need to stay out of the way. You need to let the professionals do their job and fight the fires. Maybe you need to be ready to evacuate your house. Maybe you need to welcome people who've been evacuated from elsewhere. But in terms of firefighting, there's nothing you can do." And so I want to suggest that the history of the West is actually a history of the government interposing itself between you and the problem you want to solve. Some of the first people who were here were facing predators and threatening their livestock, and so they wanted to solve that problem by killing those predators. Over the last 100 years now, that's increasingly hard to do. The government wants to know what's going on, how many wolves you've shot. They're not really into that whole shoot, shovel, and shut up routine. The vigilantes in Virginia City in the 1860s, I think it was, were interested in justice, and they were going to accomplish justice on their own. They knew who had robbed the bank or killed somebody, and so they were going to track down that person and make sure that they didn't do it again. And the government came in and said, no. Government has a monopoly on justice. You can't do it yourself. You have to go through the courts. You have to take these extra steps where the government has put itself in between you and the problem you want to solve. And of course, recently in healthcare, the government is inserting itself between you and your relationship with your doctor. You want to solve your health problem, and you have this government-approved insurance notion that complicates it. Personally, I find most of these developments excusable, perhaps even necessary. A civilized society requires that you don't have vigilantes going off and doing their own thing. It was just sort of a quirk of history that for a while the West was so unpopulated that it wasn't obvious that we needed these government institutions to help us work through these issues. And so we could look at this development and say, well, yeah, okay, that's civilization, that's the way it works. But I think as we do so, we also need to acknowledge that it is a change from the traditional Western values of doing things yourself and solving those issues yourself. And so if we are going to favor these government policies, we do need to acknowledge that they are difficult and not necessarily the way it has always been done. Because the other thing is that after the government sticks itself in between you and your problem, it then asks you to pay for it. And so the notion of not wanting higher taxes may actually come from this traditional value of, well, no, I want to do it myself. Why do I have to give up control and give up money? And it's not just about taxes, it's also about our discourse. I gave a talk similar to this last March at an event in Red Lodge called the Forum for Provocative Issues, where they gather once a month and discuss some provocative issue. About a year ago, they had the superintendent of Yellowstone Park, Dan Wenck, come and talk about the fact that Yellowstone wasn't sure it wanted to plow the Beartooth Highway anymore in the spring, which was a pretty provocative issue in Red Lodge, let me tell you. And a friend of mine who was there walked out just really disgusted with the whole event. And I said, why? And wishing to remain anonymous, he or she wrote me, Superintendent Wenck was here, the mayor of Cody was here. Cody had plowed its road itself, and Red Lodge might have been able to learn from that. So these people were here, and I thought this forum would be something special, and it was just another gripe session. Everybody in the audience who spoke wanted somebody else to pay for Yellowstone. Wyoming has energy money, why don't they pay? Seniors have money, why don't they pay? People kept asking Wenck why he couldn't use these dollars for that purpose or those dollars for this purpose, like the man doesn't spend most of his waking hours trying to push money from one account to another. So this event, which had been organized for us to discuss provocative issues and to think about philosophies and values and how we interact with them, ended up being a discussion about accounting. So it's sort of interesting the way the function of government has changed the way we interact with each other. It probably has done so all around the country, but it's sort of unique in the West because we had this weird period in the 1800s where there were so few people around here that there really wasn't very much government. So that's the second sort of interesting, provocative thing I have in terms of talking about unique Western values. The third subject I'd like to talk about is classlessness, sense of social class, or perhaps lack thereof. When I was growing up in suburban Boston, my parents at one point, they actually vocalized the realization that they had no friends who hadn't gone to college. At that point, it was maybe 20% of the American population was college educated. And all of their personal relationships were drawn from that tiny sliver of the population. I was a teenager at the time, and so I was horrified by everything my parents did. But I was especially horrified by that notion that they weren't engaging with an entire population. And then in my early 20s, after college, when I was living in Boston, I discovered myself going down that same path. And so part of my move to Red Lodge was in 1990, when Red Lodge was a lot less sophisticated than it is now, was this desire to interact with a fuller population. And I was impressed that a lot of my friends hadn't gone to college. A lot of them didn't know whether they'd been to college or not, because you had all sorts of, you were never using your actual degree, especially in the tourist industry. And so for me, at that point, Red Lodge felt like the kind of place where anybody could have power, anybody could have class. It didn't matter what you did or what your credentials were. You just, if you wanted to do something, you could do it. I really loved that. And I started to realize that maybe that's a common theme or value in the West in general. Anyone here ever heard of Louis Lundborg, chairman of the board of Bank of America back 50 years ago or so? He grew up in Billings early in the 20th century. And he wrote a memoir of his life called Up to Now, which Sue Hart, I'm sure a lot of you remember Sue, Sue quoted this in a article in Magic City magazine, Reflections of a Precarious Past from a Prosperous Present. And Louis Lundborg wrote, Billings in the 1910s was as nearly a classless society as anyone could envision. There were families with more money and families with less, but no one could see any line between the two. We all attended the same schools, we all attended the same schools, and not only did we all play on the same football teams, act in the same plays, and belong to the same debating societies, but after school we went to each other's homes with no thought of crossing lines. So this notion that there are no class lines, especially for kids, boy, isn't that wonderful? I mean, I think we all really identify with that. And certainly America was founded with the notion that we were going to have a lot fewer class distinctions than Europe. We weren't going to have dukes and earls and all these forms of nobility. And yet I knew growing up in the East that there were certainly class divisions, that we had created these divisions. And for me, coming west, I found a lot fewer of them and have found this through history as an important value that people keep bringing up. Another one related to Billings is Gwendolyn Haste. Gwendolyn Haste moved to Billings in about 1910 to work for a magazine that her father owned. And she later moved to New York City and became a relatively famous poet. Often wrote poems about the homesteaders that she'd met in Montana. At one point wrote a memoir that was not published, but I think it was Sue Hart again who tracked it down. And in that memoir, she speaks of women from all parts of Billings gathering in the kitchen of the P.B. Moss home to roll bandages or learn to knit socks, caps, and gloves for soldiers serving in World War I. I believe during World War I, the P.B. Moss home is what we now know as the Moss Mansion. Yes. Can you imagine women from the South Side going to the Moss Mansion to roll bandages or knit socks? What a great image of classlessness at that time. Let me close with one more image of classlessness, and that's from a woman named Haiti Yates. Haiti Yates was the first female contributor to the New Yorker's Talk of the Town series. She had a marvelous sort of breezy style, typical of the New Yorker. This was in the 1920s, but the New Yorker style has remained wonderfully consistent over the years. Haiti had also been on a dude ranch outside of Cody. She was a dudine. That's what they called the female dudes back then, dudines. And so after being a dudine, she went back to New York and had this job, and then got fed up with New York and built a ranch on Lodgegrass Creek between here and Sheridan, Wyoming. She wrote a great memoir of that time called 70 Miles from a Lemon, because she was 70 miles from Sheridan, which was the nearest place you could get any sort of groceries, including fresh fruit. And after a few years on the ranch, she actually moved into Sheridan and worked as the editor of the newspaper there. And she, during the time she was in Sheridan, she lived at the Sheridan Inn, and she described it this way: "It's the gathering place of ranchers, state politicians, pensioners of one sort or another, rich ne'er-do-wells, spinster schoolmarms, dudes in expensive buckskins, and dudines in fringe and fashionable permanents, sourdoughs, old-timers, and jolly rum-runners. The narrow, dark halls were perpetually whirling with the drifting eddies of people going in and out of each other's rooms." And she wrote this about Sheridan itself: "The Nob Hill among the Rockies peaks. They were the sons, nephews, nieces, and uncles of dukes and earls, or earls in their own right. Not that they cared. There was not 1 ounce of snob about them. The members of this recherché group were interesting individuals and real." So for Haiti, what was important was the authenticity, that people were real. What was not important was their class, whether they were dukes or earls. It could, again, I don't want to declare any of these values as good or bad. I just want to declare them as interesting. It could be that classlessness is something that's only of interest to the upper classes. Haiti, with her wealth and her New York connections, perhaps valued the way that she could interact with people of other classes and feel like they were being authentic with her. Maybe the people of other classes didn't really care about Haiti and this notion of classlessness. You could argue the same thing about Louis Lundborg or Gwendolyn Haste. Caroline Lockhart gets into a lot of these class issues as well. She loved that classlessness in Cody at that same time, and yet Caroline came from a lot of money and was happy to use it. But it is an interesting difference in the way that people who have money or class choose to live their lives, the places that they want to live, and the people that they want to experience. These are things that I've learned over the course of writing and researching Montana history, some themes that have jumped out to me: classlessness, government, authenticity. As I said earlier, I just find them interesting things to talk about, interesting ways to view society, and they often lead to interesting discussions. And so I hope that as you go forward today and during this week, they might lead to interesting discussions for you. Thank you.